Let's talk about the logoi. Did Luke modify Papias's logoi, or did he copy Papias's redaction of the logoi? In other words, is Papias's redaction of the logoi very much the same that we see in Luke's, or are there some major differences?
Well, let's get the Papias piece a little clearer.
Mhm.
Papias is citing John the Elder, who has a problem. He's got three Greek Gospels. Two of them had been attributed apparently to Matthew. One of them had been attributed to Mark. Uh, yes, Mark. Now, Mark's source of information was the preaching of Peter, and because Mark did not himself know Jesus. Matthew knew Jesus and wrote a gospel in Hebrew that then two Greek translators translated but botched. So
Mm.
both of them are problematic. So we don't have anything from Papias that we can use to reconstruct the Q document. We only have his evidence that there was such a alternative Matthew, which could be Q, maybe isn't Q. And for your viewers, what people have called Q in the past, I prefer to call Q plus
Hmm.
because my reconstruction is larger, or it's most likely titled The Logoi of Jesus. So the Logoi of Jesus is a rewriting of Deuteronomy to show that Jesus is the more compassionate prophet like Moses that was promised in Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy. And it includes almost no named characters. There is a list of disciples that ends, as I said, with Judas, the son of James. Jesus is named, and John the Baptist is named. But there are no named characters otherwise, and the disciples are listed, but they are not named in the narrative. So
Hmm.
the Q document does not, and this is true for Papias too. Papias knows of Judas and surely the other characters too, though the fragments don't preserve it. But um, so Papias, so Luke is using the Logoi of Jesus, Mark and Matthew, and Papias. But to the extent that we can identify it, all of these names come from Mark. None of them appeared in the hypothetical Hebrew Matthew or in the Logoi of Jesus.
Do you think that the Gospel of the Hebrews that later church fathers talk about has anything to do with the gospel, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that Papias mentioned? Or are they two
Absolutely
different
not.
texts?
No, it has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
I mean, if you want, I can give you some evidence for it, but
sure.
I think it has nothing
I
to do.
like that.
Okay, well, the evidence, you want some evidence
Yeah.
for it? One is we don't have any citations of the Gospel of the Egyptians until later. Another is that the Gospel of the Egyptians has narrative occasionally, some of which already have that have parallels in the Synoptics, where the Synoptic authors probably have been imitating Homer. So
Hmm.
um, it's not going to be earlier than Mark. It's dependent on Mark to some extent. The earliest references we have to the Gospel of the Hebrews, and I'm not an authority on this, although at one point I thought I was. Um, the the evidence for the Gospel of the Hebrews is probably not until the second half of the second century.
Hmm.
Um, a curious piece, though, is the Gospel of the Hebrews may have known Papias because both Papias, according to Eusebius, both Papias and the Gospel of the Hebrews has the story of Jesus forgiving the adulterous woman.
Hmm.
So that's an interesting overlap. Um,
How different, and I know you said in the question before last question that we don't really know what Papias' logo looked like too much. But anyhow, how different do you think Papias' logo might have been compared to Matthew Oristion's logo and the original logo?
well, first of all, we will never know what the original logo was.
Hmm.
And I think my reconstruction is the best one I'm aware of. Um, and so I would like to think that what Papias saw was what I have recovered. So, but of course, there's no way of knowing it. Now, the other thing, Jacob, is no two manuscripts of Gospels are identical in that early period. It's not until we get much later, maybe even the third century, before we have standardized texts of the Gospels, although the process begins in the second century. So there is absolutely no possibility that what I have reconstructed on modern historical criteria is identical to what Papias or Luke or anybody would have seen, because the content of these things change, especially when they're not protected by canonical reception. And so anything that I reconstruct is going to be different from what Papias saw. It's going to be different from Matthew, Luke, and Mark, which I think they all saw. So it really makes this whole project much more difficult to have confidence about. That there was a lost gospel, I think, should no longer be debated, although it certainly is debated. But the text is going to be eternally elusive, and I think we can live with that. I think the general contours, however, are clear. And this is why social identity criticism, in my view, is so important. If we're interested in recovering the wording of a document, we've got the problem of all text critics that these materials are plastic. They are not in stone. But if we talk about social identity criticism, then we can talk. We don't have to worry about minute philological um, identities. We are talking about social identities, and the materials that I've identified as coming from the Logo of Jesus have a very predictable social context.
Hmm.
And Jesus plays a particular kind of role as the prototypical leader. The insiders are depicted in certain kinds of ways, outsiders are villainized in certain ways. And so the way I like to put it is we don't have the exact whereabout or words of the Logo of Jesus, but we do have its vox, its voice. The sociological voices, I think, is clear. And I think that's a better way to think about how the Logo of Jesus makes itself felt in the synoptics, because they have a different social identity. Jesus has a different function. The in group is different. The out groups are different.
Hmm.
So I think we need to move away from what the Germans would call a buchstäblich understanding, that is, a literal understanding of the language, and be happy to settle for the sociological and theological voices that we hear in these materials.
What are the main parallels between Luke Acts and Virgil's works that convince you that Luke Acts knew and copied from Virgil?
Um, I would never argue that Luke copied from Virgil. I
Okay.
think the evidence of Luke knowing Latin um, is strong, but not strong enough to say that Luke was easily conversant in Latin. I think it goes, though, it can be said that Luke is certainly aware of Virgil's Aeneid, and that it attempted to establish Roman identity by imitating Homeric epics. And Luke must have seen that Mark already had imitated the Homeric epics in places where we have overlapping content with the Iliad.
Hmm.
So what we have is competitive mimesis, and we have other examples of this in antiquity, where people try to outdo each other in imitating Homer in order to advance their own sociological commitments. So that Luke is a rival to the Homeric imitations the of Virgil, instead of directly imitating Virgil. Now there are a couple of places where Luke may, in fact, be tipping his hand that he is directly imitating Virgil, but they're somewhat too flimsy to rest much on.
Hmm.
But you wanted to have some examples of the ones
Sure.
that, Odysseus has a famous shipwreck scene in Book 5, and another in Book 12 of the Odyssey. Virgil begins his Aeneid with a shipwreck story that casts Aeneas and his ships at the shores of Carthage. That certainly imitates the shipwreck scene in Odyssey 5. And Luke ends the Acts of the Apostles with a shipwreck story that takes him ultimately to Rome. And it has its own imitations, clearly, of Odyssey 5. Also, these shipwreck stories, the shipwreck story in the Odyssey 12 and the Acts of the Apostles are told in the first person plural. We did this, we did that, we had this problem, we shipwrecked, and so on. That's one very good example. Another is we have a story of Cornelius in the Acts of the Apostles getting a vision, Paul having an ecstatic experience, and the merging of Gentiles and Jews at a council because of this confluence of the dream and the ecstasy. We have the same kind of thing happening in the Iliad in Book 2, where Zeus sends a lying dream to Agamemnon. Agamemnon then tries to dupe his own troops into a demonstration of loyalty, but they bolt. And Odysseus tells them about a portent they had, and the portent had to do with a serpent devouring 9 chicks and a mother hen, to symbolize the 9 years of struggle in the Trojan War and the devouring then of Troy in the 10th. And this lying dream became a real problem for Greek theology. The portent, the ecstasy that Peter has in the Acts of the Apostles includes reptiles and birds. I wonder why that is. And the combination of a true dream to Cornelius and this portent of the serpents and birds for Peter issues not in disaster as in the Iliad, but in the merging of Jews and Gentiles. Now, Virgil imitates exactly the same material in order to talk, where you have a lying dream that comes to Turnus and it ends in destruction of his troops and so on. You have the story of Laocoon, where a serpent two serpents come out of the city and kill him and his two sons, which is like the, the serpent in the chick story in the Iliad. Now, Jacob, I'm aware that I'm now putting your audience to sleep because this stuff is pretty arcane and difficult, and people
Actually,
may know these stories very well.
I don't think you're putting my audience to sleep at all. I think they're going to be amazed when they see this. I really do.
Well, I was when I saw it. And in fact, one of the fun things about getting away from textual criticism and redaction criticism and doing mimesis criticism is it opens up so many avenues for creativity and
Mm,
imagination. It's not as wissenschaftlich, it's not as scientific as some other philological positions, but it is much more humanistic and imaginative and literary and creative. And I think biblical scholarship needs to have a really steady dosage of literary criticism to go along with philology, because we need to have the kind of imagination that goes with the interpretation of literature.
mm. Did Luke Acts copy more often from Virgil than Homer, vice versa, or would you say on equal footing?
Well, again, I would rephrase the question altogether, or
Inspired.
I would answer it in a different way.
Yeah.
I think there's very little evidence, though there is some, that Luke imitated Virgil directly, but both of them clearly imitated Homer. So that Luke Acts is a rival imitation to what he has in the Aeneid. So just as the Virgil, in writing the Aeneid, wanted to create a foundational poem, a foundational mythology for the emerging Augustan Empire, Luke did the same thing for the Empire of God, the Kingdom of God. And so that both of them are imitating Homer, but Luke is trying to show that the founders of the Jesus movement are more philosophical than Aeneas, they're less violent than Aeneas, and the God of Paul and Jesus and so on offers salvation in a way that's superior to the salvation that is offered by Rome. So I don't think it's a direct imitation. I think it's a rival imitation of Homer that we find in Luke Acts.
Can you explain the Logoi of Papias being his second translation of Matthew's Gospel?
This is a very important part of the Q plus Papias hypothesis, but it's also one that unfortunately is very difficult to nail down. So your question is a good one, and I have an answer for it, but I wouldn't be surprised that it's unacceptable to other people. I think what we can say is this: Papias and his informant, John the Elder, do not know the Gospel of Luke and do not know the Gospel of John, even though it would appear that Papias is a kind of Johannine Christian. And I can give other evidence for that. Actually, he quotes, according to Eusebius, he quotes First John quite often and the traditions of John the Elder. So John the Elder has a synoptic problem. It's actually the earliest attestation of a synoptic problem we have, except maybe Matthew's trying to put Mark and Q together. But let's leave that to the side. John the Elder and Papias know three Greek Gospels. One they attribute to Mark, and that probably is similar to our Gospel of Mark. Another they attribute to Matthew, which is similar to our Matthew, presumably. But then there's another document, a Greek document, that is attributed to Matthew that does not survive. Now, what was that document? We don't know. Now, I'm going to then go again to another statement by Eusebius. Eusebius says that Papias also relied on a document by someone named Aristion. And Aristion wrote a document, apparently, called Expositions of the Logoi of the Lord. Ton tu Q Logion Jesus. Expositions of the Logoi of the Lord. I think that was a commentary on the Logoi of Jesus. And there are a number of reasons for saying that that was the title of the lost gospel. Okay, well, that's speculative too, but it's a fascinating piece that he was considered a disciple of Jesus, and he wrote a commentary on a book apparently called the Logoi of the Lord. The other is that Papias gives the impression, so already John the Elder, they're concerned that Mark's gospel is so much shorter than what we have in Matthew, but that Matthew, the two versions of Matthew, have logia, that is things Jesus said and did, pericope, in a different taxis, that is a different sequence. So Papias says later that he wants to restore Matthew's order and augment it with oral traditions in order to get the taxis correct that was in the original Matthew. So as far as we can tell, the Logoi of Jesus has many parallels to our canonical Matthew, but in virtually every case, they're in a different taxis. They're in a different order. That's exactly what we have in a comparison of the reconstruction of the Logoi of Jesus, either in the critical edition of Q or with me and Matthew. Also, there are similarities in Q and Matthew of Aramaic wording. Now, or Semitic language. So this is also something that John the Elder and Papias held to, that there was a Semitic original gospel, though it does not survive. Here's another thing, Jacob, that I think is fascinating. When Papias realizes that the three Greek gospels he have need to have a solution to their various different sequences, he comes up with this, a hypothetical source for Mark, namely Peter's preaching. And Peter preached rather randomly and was not concerned about writing a chronology. So here we have memoirs of his preaching. But then we have these two Gospels of Matthew. Now, how do we settle on how to explain these differences? And what they do, what Papias does at least, is he is a source critic. He's trying to reconstruct a source by comparing the Q document and Matthew. That's what Q experts still do today. That's what I try to do. I'm a source critic. I'm trying to find what source, a hypothetical absent text, we can use scientifically to restore what seems to have been a lost gospel. That's exactly what Papias and probably John the Elder were trying to do. So this issue of being source critics in the 21st century needs to be understood as a very ancient enterprise that took place already by the end of the first century. So that this, people say that source criticism is unreliable because it's a modern phenomenon, it's only driven by modern science and so on, is bullshit. This phenomenon of trying to find, to postulate missing texts in order to make sense of disparities between and similarities between two documents is a very ancient enterprise. Isn't that a fascinating observation? I really love that way of thinking.
It makes sense to me. Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dennis. This has been very fun. I'd like to do this again sometime soon.
Okay, thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.